War often demands a simple, brutal morality, us versus them. The soldier's duty is to his comrades. His weapon is for the enemy. But what happens when that clear line dissolves into a fog of horror? What does a soldier do when the greatest threat to innocent life is not the enemy, but his own side? On the morning of March the 16th, 1968, in a small Vietnamese hamlet, one American helicopter pilot was confronted with this impossible choice. He was a young warrant officer, flying a small observation helicopter, whose job was to find the enemy and draw their fire. But on that day, the only fire he saw was being directed at unarmed old men, women and children. In a series of courageous and profoundly defiant acts, he would land his helicopter in the middle of a massacre place, his own body between American soldiers and Vietnamese civilians, and order his gunner to open fire on fellow Americans if they continued the killing. His name was Hugh Thompson, Jr., and this is the story of the day he redefined the meaning of a soldier's duty. Our story takes place in Quang Ngai Province, a volatile and dangerous area of South Vietnam. The region was a known stronghold of the Viet Cong, the elusive guerrilla force that the American military was struggling to contain. American casualties from booby traps, ambushes, and sniper fire were constant and frustrating. The soldiers of Charlie Company, 1st Battalion, 20th Infantry Regiment, had suffered significant losses in the weeks leading up to March the 16th. They were angry, they were frightened, and they had been told by their commanders that the collection of hamlets known as My Lai was a hotbed of Viet Cong activity. They were told to expect a fierce firefight. They were told that all innocent civilians would have left for the market by 7 a.m., and that anyone remaining was either a Viet Cong sympathizer or an active enemy combatant. The orders they received were tragically ambiguous, but the message many of the young soldiers heard was clear. This was a chance to strike back. This was a chance for revenge. Flying high above this unfolding situation was 24-year-old Hugh Thompson, Jr. He was the pilot of a small, agile H-23 Raven observation helicopter. His call sign was Warlock. He would fly low and fast, trying to spot enemy positions and draw their fire, which would then be suppressed by the heavily armed Cobra gunships flying escort above him. His two-man crew consisted of his crew chief, a specialist named Glenn Andriotta, and his door gunner, Specialist Lawrence Colburn. They were a tight-knit team, accustomed to the daily dance with death. As the operation began, Thompson flew his helicopter over the hamlet of My Lai 4. The artillery barrage had just lifted, and American troops were moving in. Thompson's job was to find the enemy they were supposed to be engaging. But as he swooped low over the village, he saw something deeply unsettling. He saw no enemy soldiers. He saw only civilians, women, children, and old men running in fear. He marked the location of several wounded civilians with green smoke, a signal for the American infantry on the ground to provide medical aid. He then flew away to check another part of the village. When he returned a few minutes later, he made a horrifying discovery. The people he had marked with smoke were not being treated. They were dead, lying in a pile, having been executed by American soldiers. A cold dread began to creep into Thompson's mind. Something was terribly, terribly wrong. He radioed his superiors, his voice tense, reporting the sight of a large number of civilian bodies. The response from the ground was casual, dismissing it as the result of artillery. But Thompson knew what he had seen. Artillery leaves craters and indiscriminate wounds. This was not the collateral damage of war. This was something else. This was murder. His confusion turned to horror as he flew towards a ditch on the eastern side of the hamlet. The ditch was filled with over 100 Vietnamese civilians, moaning and writhing. Standing over them were American soldiers from Charlie Company, systematically shooting them. Thompson watched, his mind unable to process the scene, as a captain prodded a wounded person in the ditch and then shot them at point-blank range. In that moment, Hugh Thompson was faced with a choice that would define his life. He could fly away, pretend he hadn't seen it, and save his own career and perhaps his own life. Or he could intervene. He could act. Floating in his helicopter a few hundred feet above the carnage, he made his decision. He was an American soldier, and his duty was to protect the innocent. It didn't matter what uniform the perpetrators were wearing. He spotted a small group of terrified civilians, including children, running towards a makeshift bunker, trying to escape the slaughter. He saw a group of American soldiers, led by a lieutenant, in hot pursuit. He knew what was about to happen. Thompson dove his helicopter down, landing it directly in the path of the advancing American soldiers. The flimsy plexiglass and metal of his small helicopter was now the only thing standing between the soldiers and the civilians cowering in the bunker. He jumped out of the cockpit and ran to confront the American lieutenant in charge. The noise of the rotors was deafening, the air thick with tension. Thompson, a warrant officer, was outranked by the lieutenant. But in that moment, rank meant nothing. Thompson screamed at the lieutenant, asking him how he was going to get the civilians out of the bunker. The lieutenant replied that he would get them out with a hand grenade. The conversation that followed was one of the most courageous and confrontational acts of the entire war. Thompson told the lieutenant to hold his men where they were. He then turned to his own crew, to the two young specialists in his helicopter, Andriotta and Colburn. He gave them an order that no American soldier should ever have to hear. He told them to train their M60 machine guns on the American soldiers. And he told them, if they open up on me or the civilians, you open up on them. You fire. Lawrence Colburn, the 18-year-old door gunner, couldn't believe what he was hearing. "You mean it?" he asked. Thompson stared back at him, his face a mask of grim determination. "You're goddamn right, I mean it," he said. Colburn and Andriotta turned their guns around and aimed them at their fellow Americans. For that moment in time, the battlefield had been turned upside down. The enemy was no longer the Viet Cong. The enemy was a group of U.S. soldiers who had lost their humanity. With his own crew providing cover, Hugh Thompson walked over to the bunker. He coaxed out about a dozen terrified, weeping civilians, mostly women and children. He knew he couldn't leave them there. His small observation helicopter only had room for 3 people. He had to radio for help. He called in his 2 escorting Cobra gunships, who were not involved in the massacre, asking them to land. He explained the situation, and the gunships landed, creating a protective wall around the civilians. Thompson then managed to get a larger transport helicopter to come in and evacuate the group he had saved. As the transport lifted off, Thompson and his crew got back in their own helicopter, their work not yet done. They took off again, flying low over the hellscape of My Lai. They spotted the irrigation ditch again, the one filled with bodies. But amidst the dead, they saw movement. There was a survivor. Despite the risk of being shot at by the very soldiers he was trying to expose, Thompson landed his helicopter a second time. His crew chief, Glenn Andriotta, jumped out and waded into the ditch, into the pile of bloody bodies. He emerged carrying a small child, a boy of about 4 or 5 years old, who was miraculously alive, having been shielded by his mother's body. They brought the boy back into the helicopter. With this one small child as a living testament to the day's horrors, Thompson's crew finally flew away from My Lai, their fuel and their emotional endurance completely exhausted. They flew the boy to a nearby civilian hospital, saving one more life from the madness. Upon returning to base, Hugh Thompson did not stay silent. He immediately and angrily reported what he had seen to his superiors. His report was so vehement, so filled with righteous fury, that it could not be ignored. It was Thompson's initial report that finally led to a ceasefire order being issued, bringing the massacre at My Lai to an end after 4 horrific hours. In that time, it's estimated that as many as 500 unarmed Vietnamese civilians had been murdered. In the immediate aftermath, Hugh Thompson was not treated as a hero. He was treated as a pariah. An official cover-up of the massacre began almost immediately. The initial reports claimed a major victory against a hardened Viet Cong unit. Thompson's eyewitness account was a dangerous threat to this lie. He was ostracized by fellow officers. For his actions, he was quietly awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross. But the citation was a work of fiction, praising him for his bravery in a fierce firefight, with no mention of saving civilians from American soldiers. It was an attempt to buy his silence. For over a year, the truth of My Lai remained hidden from the American public. It was only through the determined efforts of an investigative journalist named Seymour Hersh that the story finally broke. When it did, the cover-up unraveled. Hugh Thompson was called to testify before Congress. He was vilified by many, including members of Congress, who saw his actions as a betrayal of the U.S. Army. He received death threats. He had dead animals left on his doorstep. Tragically, Glenn Andriotta, the crew chief who had waded into the ditch to rescue the small boy, was killed in action just 3 weeks after the massacre, never living to see the impact of his courageous act. Hugh Thompson and Lawrence Colburn continued to serve, but the weight of what they had seen and done never left them. For 30 years, their heroism went officially unrecognized. They were the men who had stopped a massacre, but they were treated as if they were the ones who had committed it. It wasn't until 1998, after a long campaign by a university professor who had learned of their story, that the Army finally decided to right this historical wrong. In a quiet ceremony, Hugh Thompson, Lawrence Colburn, and Glenn Andriotta posthumously were awarded the Soldier's Medal, the Army's highest award for bravery not involving direct conflict with an enemy. The citation for the medal finally told the truth. At the ceremony, Thompson, a man broken by years of being treated as a villain, finally felt a sense of vindication. The story of Hugh Thompson at My Lai is a searing, uncomfortable, and profoundly important ember from the Vietnam War. It is a story that forces us to ask the most difficult questions about war, duty, and morality. Thompson's actions stand as a powerful testament to the idea that a soldier's ultimate duty is not to his uniform, not to his flag, and not to his orders, but to his own conscience and to the preservation of human life. On a day when humanity was in short supply, he landed his helicopter in the heart of the darkness and created a small, defiant circle of light.